Hello, everyone, and welcome to this WAPPP and UNCTAD roundtable on the subject of opportunities and challenges for green levers in port concession PPPs. We are delighted to continue our cooperation with my name first, actually, I should say. My name is Ziad Alexander Hayek. I'm the president of WAPPP, and we are delighted to continue our cooperation and joint work with UNCTAD, which we started late last year at the Abu Dhabi Investment Forum, and continuing through a series of events and publications, hopefully in this year. So delighted to be here. Welcome to all of you again. This is a very important subject as it affects the global community, and the PPP community as a whole is very interested in this. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Neil Davidson, who is going to moderate this panel today. Neil has over 30 years of experience in the port sector, retiring in 2020. His initial industry experience included working for Lloyd's of London, the Medway Ports Authority, as well as the Port of Tilbury in the UK. He joined Drury Shipping Consultants in 1997 and founded the company's ports practice. His consultancy experience included participation in port projects.
Looks like the system's got bored with hearing about my my CV, and Ziad has frozen. So I think you got the gist anyway about me. So we can carry on, I think, with the session. So yeah, I think hopefully everybody knows about WAPPP and its mandate to support PPP research and expertise. And yeah, this particular session is being run by the port chapter of WAPPP, of which I'm a member, and it was sparked by the DP World APM Terminals white paper published last year on electrification of container handling equipment, and the connection with port concessions and the possibility of introducing green levers into those port concessions. So that's the focus of today's session. We've got 4 speakers, hopefully 4. I think we're missing one at the moment, but hopefully we can sort the technical side out and get the 4th one in. But with 4 speakers. And the first one today is Rico Salgman from the World Bank's Global Transport Unit, transport specialist. And he's been working on the bank's engagement in shipping and ports. And prior to that, he's worked in the shipping industry, the offshore industry, and at Credit Suisse, so extremely experienced in these matters. And Rico is going to give us the overview, really, of energy transition in ports, which is a big subject and a lot of different aspects. So he's going to set the scene for us, really, to talk about the the big picture, particularly in developing countries. So if I can hand over to you, Rico, and you can share your screen, I hope.
Sure. Thank you so much, Neil, and thanks everyone for joining in. Let me just quickly get my presentation up and running.
And welcome to James. I can see James has made it into the session, so that's great news. So we have our 4 speakers with us.
I hope you can all see my screen in presentation mode. If that's the case, then we're good to go. Neil, can you confirm, is the screen visible to everybody?
Not yet, but
Not yet. Oh, that's not good.
I may need to do something. Perhaps JC can help with that. Here we go. Here we go.
Does that look better?
Yep, I can see it now, so that's great.
Okay, I'm screen sharing. All right, that should be working now, right?
Yeah, that looks great.
Fantastic. Well, yeah, thanks everybody. I think the intention of my little intervention here was to put this interesting webinar in a bit of a global context and share a bit what the World Bank is doing on maritime energy transition, and I think that using that then as a basis to dig deeper into the topic for which I think we have a lot of participants who are very experienced in the important details in PPP setups and the way these green elements could be incorporated into it. So you've mentioned it. I'm here with the Global Transport Unit of the World Bank, so I'm not going to dwell on my CV in the interest of time. What we do here, based out of Washington D.C., is basically to support all kinds of transport modes and infrastructure investments in various transport modes in developing countries, from rail through shipping, aviation, and urban mobility. And I'm part of the shipping team, which has a dedicated focus on shipping decarbonization. And I think in terms of the World Bank mission, we start from the big picture of what shipping does to us in terms of development impact, which is very positive, as the majority of trade is obviously moved by ships, and the majority of trade volumes are handled in developing countries. So this is the primary mission of the bank, to facilitate trade and let our client countries participate. But at the same time, shipping also has an environmental footprint, which is important to take a closer look at. It accounts for 3% of global greenhouse gas emissions. That would make shipping rank between the 6th and the 10th largest emitter on Earth if it was a country. And obviously that's something where shipping has now, shipping is benefits from a global regulator, the International Maritime Organization, and governments came together and set certain greenhouse gas reduction targets to align shipping with a pathway which is close to the targets of the Paris Agreement. And since July last year, governments agreed to reduce shipping emissions to net zero by 2050, including a trajectory setting out interim checkpoints in 2030 and 2040. And that obviously cannot be achieved overnight. That is absolutely clear. And the tools we have to employ to reach these emissions reductions is, of course, to improve the energy efficiency of ships. That has also an operational component where ports come into play. But of course, ultimately, these deep emission cuts can only be achieved by introducing zero carbon fuels. And I'm going to talk about the type of fuels in a minute, since the production and the supply of these fuels, again, have a huge, make the port a critical node in this new value chain. When we look at this challenge, this particular challenge for developing countries, it also comes with an opportunity, comes with an investment opportunity, which mainly, and again, this is good news for the port system and the energy system, where mainly the investments will be land-based. You see it in these charts. Land-based investments needed to roll out zero carbon fuel productions are in hydrogen production, ammonia synthesis, but also in terminal infrastructure to bunker these fuel types, tank farms and the likes, and only a fraction of, on average, 15% is needed on board. So that's the ship owner side, something we're not concerned with today. The question now is how does the development bank approach this topic? How do we go about it? What is needed to, make countries participate in it? And we follow their kind of a, twofold approach. One is on the global policy side, and one is on the country side, where we work directly with our clients and including port authorities. So on the global side, we've done some research in the past years on fuel pathways for global shipping, and we find that green hydrogen-based fuels like methanol, ammonia, which are quite widely discussed today, are the most promising fuels from a techno-economic perspective to decarbonize shipping most effectively. And unsurprisingly, all these fuels, which require significant input of renewable energy, unsurprisingly, those high potential countries often lie in the global south due to favorable conditions for renewable energy. Now, within our countries, we are kind of in the initial phase of the energy transition, where I think for lots of countries, we have to do a bit of pipeline sounding, where we have to provide technical assistance to understand what the opportunities are, what they have to get prepared for. And what we do with a lot of countries you see here on the map is we look at pre-feasibility assessments for infrastructure options in the ports, that can range from production facilities, but also bunker supply facilities. We do kind of national demand analysis on hydrogen, going into the shipping sector potentially, and that involves obviously a holistic approach to planning that green shipping transition where ports play a major role. Of course, as a bank, financing and the enabling environment on the policy side are key aspects as well. But again, we're in the early years of this transition. And to unlock this transition, it's absolutely clear that in shipping, this can only work with global policy. So the World Bank also has a seat in the IMO, not as a voting organization, but as an observer organization alongside other groups. I'm not sure if WAPPP is also part of it, but the International Association of Ports and Harbors and others are observers to the IMO too. And the World Bank on top is part of the UN family. So we use our mandate there to advocate for policy, which will then stimulate the uptake of these fuel types. Now, when we zoom into the country engagements, we see a lot of interest from the port sector to position ports as hubs for energy exports, new energy exports, like ammonia, hydrogen derivatives in general, but also to be new supply centers for marine fuel, that green marine fuel we talk about, which could lead to a shift or a reconfiguration of the bunker market, which is now obviously focused around or centered around the main bunker supply hubs such as Singapore, Rotterdam, Houston. But then ports can also act as aggregators for hydrogen in industrial applications like in steel making, fertilizers, and the likes. So what we always used to say is that without maritime transport, there's no energy transition. And at the same time, without these new energies, there's no shipping decarbonization. So these things are closely interlinked. And again, the port sector plays a critical role, a platform for the supply and the handling and the aggregation of these hydrogen-based fuels. Again, what I mentioned earlier, if we look at the fuel mix of shipping, we see a heavy focus on hydrogen. That's something which we have concluded, and others as well. 14 different models in shipping show that hydrogen is clearly the focus pathway. And I think that helps us to define what infrastructure is needed and what we should focus on when we engage with countries, when we engage with port authorities, to identify these options. And when we look at sort of that new ecosystem of marine fuels, it often has the opportunity to also solve other development issues. I entitled the slide, How to Create Infrastructure for Green Shipping Fuels with Co-Benefit. And I guess that's something, it's also a segue into the PPP discussion. For marine fuels, again, we talk hydrogen, which requires water. We talk renewable electricity, which is absolutely critical for countries which have a constraint in affordable and clean power. And of course, ports will then play a distinctive role to bring these exports to the market. And I'm not going to dwell too much on the big picture because we have a lot of things to discuss in detail here. But for us, what we see a lot of countries do, governments do, port authorities do, is they take a very structured approach to this issue with the help of development partners, but also on their own, where lots of port authorities set up dedicated project offices to see what is the private sector pipeline in my hinterland or in my port area who are looking to produce green ammonia, green methanol, or whatever they want to do in terms of beneficiation of hydrogen. And then, of course, this is, I think, the elephant in the room very often, where sort of these hydrogen investments are highly capital intensive, and where this whole industry is still nascent and is kind of waiting for concrete demand signal also from the IMO, is what is the role of the private and the public sector in this? Are PPPs an option, and for which component of this whole value chain are they an option? And as a last step, of course, once that is identified, it's a critical role for development banks, but most importantly for private capital to take this infrastructure to market, have a business case, and then sort of harness this opportunity. So I leave it to this. It's more of I hope this is more of a inspiring pitch than a concrete answer, and I'm very curious about the discussion and then where the experts in the room have seen PPPs already being considered in these new technologies as well. And I thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rico. That's great overview, and it sort of shows what a big topic this is in its entirety, and also it's such an emerging topic. It's still taking shape in so many different ways. And yeah, several things struck me. Certainly the significance of the developing world in this story is so big. And also I like your graph that shows that the biggest percentage of activity is actually on the land side. We're talking about shipping, but was it 89% or whatever is on the land side. It's it's very interesting that that's the truth of the matter. And I also like your question, are PPPs an option? Can they work? Do they have a role in all of this? So yeah, thank you very much for that. It's a great overview. Just to remind attendees, there is a Q&A box that you can click on if you want to ask questions that we can either do as we go along or at the end. So you can put them into the Q&A box, not the chat box, but the Q&A one that you'll find at the bottom. So yeah, let's move on next to our next speaker, who's Piotr Konopka from DP World. He's Group Vice President for Energy and Decarbonisation Programs at DP World. So he's overseeing the electrification, process efficiency, renewable energy, really taking a very wide remit across DP World's activities on this subject. A graduate of Sustainable Energy Futures at Imperial College London, so extremely well qualified. And Piotr is going to bring us into some sharp focus now, having had the overview from Rico of talking about getting to zero emission and electrification of container handling equipment, and in particular, how that can potentially be influenced in terms of port concessions and green levers. So Piotr, can I hand over to you?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Neil. Thank you for the invitation. Also, great introduction from Rico. I have to apologize if there is any background noise. I'm currently in Copenhagen at the Maersk Mc-Kinney Møller Center for Zero Carbon Shipping annual summit, which is another fantastic example of collaboration. But today I'm here to talk about an initiative that we have launched at COP28 with APMT, and now has actually gotten a little bit of industry attention with more partners coming along, which is about collective action about the pathway to zero emission ports. So it all started with this idea of industry conversation we had with APMT about shifting mindsets and how we get to the goal of decarbonization, right? I think it's applicable to any other industry or any other instance where we often have a specific pathway of growth, and then we set a target, and then if we try to stay on that business as usual, as ambitious it may be, there will always be a gap towards this target. Nevertheless, we've had a number of examples in the past where change has happened exponentially. It has done so for centuries. Here on the slide, you can actually see how we end up oftentimes reaching that target, right? So just focusing mainly on the energy industry, right? We've seen this in wind generation, we've seen this in solar generation, we've seen this in EV cells, and we're increasingly seeing that in energy storage, where that change has been exponential, and many times it's really gone beyond any of the projections or predictions of market experts. And we're really hoping we'll get there with the container handling equipment. You see that the energy industry in many ways is already past that tipping point. EVs are probably close, but container handling equipment and especially heavy industry are still a little bit at the beginning of that curve, right? And we believe that tipping point is only possible if it's affordable, attractive, and accessible. And therefore, it was, I guess, last year throughout 2023, with APMT, we have worked on a white paper called Reaching a Tipping Point in Battery Electric Container Handling Equipment. The white paper was actually commissioned by APMT and developed by a consulting firm called Systemic, with support of DP World and endorsement from the likes of Ports of Rotterdam, Eurogate, Smart Freight Center, and a number of other partners. I'm going to drop the link to it in the chat as soon as I stop talking. There's a LinkedIn page about it. There's a website, and that white paper is currently publicly available. So I do hope, if you haven't already, you'll get to familiarize yourself with it. So in terms of the context, focusing specifically on the container handling equipment, in order to decarbonize the ports industry, today there's around 100 to 120,000 equipment in use that needs to be decarbonized. And they can broadly be categorized into tethered and untethered. So tethered ones, for example, the rubber-tired gantries or ship-to-shore cranes, they are a little easier to electrify because they do not require a battery. It's a fixed plug connection. The challenge really comes when you're talking about untethered equipment, such as terminal tractors, straddle carriers, or reach stackers, which really face similar problems to the electric vehicle industry today and the inherent challenges of batteries, right? The range anxiety, the chemistry, the standardization, the infrastructure, and the charging network, all of that really needs to be solved. Maybe talking a little bit more about these three factors that I talked about: affordability, accessibility, and attractiveness. It must be said that battery electric container handling equipment, especially untethered, is not competitive on affordability and accessibility with diesel today. But there are a number of levers that can help us close this gap, right? On affordability, it's definitely more expensive than container handling equipment. On accessibility, there just isn't the scale or even the production capacity in the world to meet the demand. But there are a number of levers that can help improve all of that. And those include the learning effects of technology, economies of scale, reduction of charging downtime, standardization is very important, scaling that production capacity, power purchase agreements for electricity, or the training of the workforce, which is also inherent in that transition. So with that, we have this, after we completed the white paper, we have decided to launch ZEPA, which is the Zero Emission Port Alliance. And it's a membership network that APMT and DP World are the founding members of, but we currently have a bench of around 15 members, which really grows by the day, and we're still very much open to recruiting other members to join the efforts. We are about to have our first SteerCo meeting, and we intend ZEPA to run for 12 months and really focus on 4 key work streams. First one is to aggregate the projected demand, which hopefully we are encouraged scaling up of the production capacity. Secondly, the voluntary design standards. There's a lot of standards that may be competing with each other depending on what manufacturer you look at or which terminal operator looks for the equipment. So we just want to make sure that through involuntary or sometimes even voluntary design standards, we close that gap. We also want to talk about power infrastructure, absolutely crucial in the rollout and facilitation of the electric battery electric container handling equipment. And then finally, the adoption incentives. Therefore, we are very much looking forward to collaborating with the likes of port authorities, financing body, local bodies, local governments, in order to close especially that affordability gap for the players there in the market. ZEPA has a relatively simple governance structure. There's a secretariat that is run by Systemic, and we also have an appointed third-party competition lawyer, as well as a third-party engineering advisor to help us work on the design standards. We're action-oriented, focused, for members by members, open and lean. Say these are our key principles as a membership organization. And then finally, why would members join ZEPA, right? We believe that there are really significant benefits. I mean, first and the very least is just the awareness and gaining the knowledge, understanding the technologies, developing the toolkits. It's also for the OEMs to get a better understanding of what the technical needs are of terminals. We're intended to accelerate implementation. We believe that these design standards will definitely help in adoption, capturing the technology learnings. But also, we believe it's very, very important to send the correct demand signal to the OEMs so that they can also plan their production capacities accordingly. And then finally, improve business relations. You know, the key players that we advertise ZEPA to are, of course, small and large terminal operators, but also port authorities, OEMs, and knowledge partners. And we believe that bringing that community together, it's beneficial for the cause itself, but also for the organizations themselves to help develop relationships needed to decarbonize their operations. We've already started, as I've mentioned, in January 2024. In fact, we have launched this initiative at COP28 at TOC in Rotterdam, which is coming up just next month. We're going to have our first large membership gathering. As I've mentioned, we have a website. The white paper itself is publicly available. There is a LinkedIn page. So there are a lot of ways to stay connected and up to date on the initiative, which I encourage everyone to do. Of course, feel free to get in touch with myself if you're interested in learning more. And I'll be here open to any questions you may have at the end of the session. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Piotr. It's a really interesting initiative that you are running there. And one of the key words that I wrote down was exponential, the point about the fact that growth can become exponential, because I know it can be a bit disheartening when you think, well, there's just no progress, it's never going to happen. And to have the hope that exponential growth gives you, is very interesting to see that it's worked in other sectors, so that was something that struck me. And also the word untethered is very much one for everybody to keep in mind, isn't it? The significance of yes, those loose items of equipment that can freely roam are the trickiest ones to deal with. So that was interesting. And just on the question of ZEPA members, presumably you're open to membership from terminal operators, from manufacturers, port authorities, any sources, any types?
Absolutely. I mean, the current membership is, of course, APMT and DP World, but there's also smaller terminal operators like Patrick Terminals or SSA Marine. We have a few OEMs that have been committed by ZPMC or SANY. There are port authorities involved. I've mentioned the endorsements of Port of Rotterdam and Eurogate. And finally, a range of knowledge partners and, really anybody across the value chain or the supply chain that is willing to learn more or can contribute to the cause. We're very, very much open to that.
And have you made any sort of specific steps in terms of looking at green levers in port concessions? Are there any particular focus elements of that at the moment?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, as I've mentioned, we're only still kicking this initiative off, but one of the work streams will very heavily focus on recommendations around how to bake sustainability into concession agreements. And I think there are some quite kind of obvious candidates for analysis, right? Such as just requiring concession agreements to include sustainability initiatives. It's financially incentivizing them. It is extending concession agreement periods in order to be able to recuperate the investment. But I'm hoping in 12 months from now, I'm going to have a much concrete set of answers after discussing it amongst all the members and market players.
Hopefully that will grow exponentially, that thought process.
That is the hope indeed.
Yeah, yes, excellent. Thank you very much. Well, yeah, that leads us nicely into the Port Authority point of view in all of this. So I'd like to introduce Victor Algren from Port of Gothenburg, who's Head of Innovation there, and so he's responsible for electrification and hydrogen initiatives in the port. And previously that, he was very closely involved in the privatization and concession process for the Port of Gothenburg from 2011 onwards, which I was also involved with, I'm pleased to say. So we work very closely together on the whole port concession topic. So it's a great pleasure to have Victor with us to give us the Port Authority view on this subject. So the floor is yours, Victor.
Thank you, Neil. So I'll try to give the Port Authority view of the potential green levers in port concessions, which is an interesting topic for sure. And to give you first a short overview of the Port of Gothenburg, we're located in Sweden and are the largest port in the Scandinavian area. So we have quite a few different terminal operators, both container, ro-ro, finished vehicles, ferries, and quite active energy harbor. Surrounding the port area is quite a big logistic area with the increasing number of warehouses popping up. You see the names of the terminal operators. In terms of containers, we have the APM terminal handling that. 3 close by refineries. So the question about green fuels and fossil fuels, liquid bulk is very dear to us. How will they transition and be relevant in the longer perspective is something of key importance for us. Some industry cluster close by and some natural areas surrounding the port. So that's where we are. And as I mentioned, we are by far the largest port in our area in all the different segments that we have. So in terms of CO2, our objective is to reduce that by 70% to 2030. And looking at both the emissions from the port and terminals operations, the distribution to and from the port, and from the vessels entering the port and at berth, a vast majority of all the emissions come from the ships, which has quite low we cannot direct them and influence them because they're driven by the world market and what's happening on the larger stage than just what's happening in our local ports. What's happening on the terminal side and on the distribution of electric trucks and increasing share of railway traffic, that is something that we in a way can influence, but it is quite much harder for the vessel and the types of fuel that they operate. But it is so much more of importance because that's where the most of the emissions come from. In terms of port concessions, we have a few smaller concession agreements, and we have 3 to 4 larger terminal operating concessions that were derived from the port privatization process that Neil mentioned in roughly 2012. So we're quite young port authority in terms of having concession agreements. We also are governed by an environmental permit that is monitored by the one government authority, which has some green and environmental aspects that are required to fulfill. In our port, we also have a consulting board, which requires all the concessionaries to join frequently with the Port Authority as the chair to decide among initiatives on the green and the environmental aspects. And it's interesting looking back, if you remember, Neil, back on the agenda 10 years ago, we were not discussing electrification. We were not discussing hydrogen, e-fuels, even climate goals or onshore power to be regulated. So, and given that concession agreements might at least have a 25 years lifespan, it's very difficult to know what is relevant in the future in terms of green aspects. So that is the personal reflection that I make, given that we did construct concession agreements 10 years ago from the scratch. But on the positive side, introducing green levers in concession agreements from the Port Authority, I think it's quite clear that the climate and environmental aspects, I would say in general, are more maybe even much more important for the Port Authority than for the terminal operators, that we are owned by the city and the people living in our city. They are our ultimate owners, so we are inclined to be more pro both environmental and all types of emission reductions. And if we have more green levers, it's possible for the Port Authority to take more control of the port development, which is quite important as we are here for the very long run. And also, I would say, when you evaluate bids for the concession, to have a more focus on the green aspects as an evaluation criteria, that is probably the most practical way to introduce green levers, as we sort of evaluate on financial terms, operational terms, market strategy. You come up with different aspects to evaluate the bids for the concession. Here you can have an increasing amount of points given to the environment and the green aspects. What are the terminal operating promising to introduce during their period? But sort of having a more, I would say, realistic or negative aspects of this, as I mentioned, it's very hard to have visibility more than 5 or 10 years. The things that we're discussing now, no one were discussing 10 years ago. 5 years for sure, but not 10 years ago. And if our experience as Port Authority is that where we are concrete in the concession agreement, then the operators comply up until that level, and they do nothing else above that level if we're concrete in the agreement. And whenever the concessionaire goes beyond what we have concretely introduced in our agreements, they approach us as the bank, asking for money, which is quite uncomfortable being a Port Authority, to just be approached when they want money to turn green. And as an example, Piotr, you mentioned the white paper. When that sort of came to our terminal operators, there were a lot of different levers in that white paper and a lot of different initiatives. And our interpretation is that they only read that it's a possibility to have co-finance from the Port Authority. So they approached us and wanted to have co-finance. And I think that's making it a bit too easy for the terminal operators. So being concrete, it might have some challenges and be slightly difficult. Let's see if I had some more. Yeah, if I have just just a few minutes. So this is the way we view the transition to fossil-free fuels, that we're moving away from potentially the fossil fuel to a variety of different new fuels, new bunkers, hydrogen-based biofuels, and then there will be many different types of fuel, also pure electric, of course. This is just showing a study that I have conducted to show the amount of power that our local port is facing, several hundred percentages increase of power that we need to electrify the port according to our present scenario. And looking at what's happening now, where very many different initiatives, both for hydrogen and electrification. And that has concluded us, sorry, some of this is in Swedish. We are located in a city which also has a quite drastic increase of electricity demand that needs to be taken into account. And increasing for ports is to view the offshore wind farm activities. How can they solve? So we have actively bought a small stake in the most local offshore wind farm to supply our port with electricity for the future. So trying to be really active in this transition. Yeah, I think that's it for me.
Thank you very much, Victor. Really interesting stuff there. That was, it's amazing that 3% of emissions from ports and terminals, and 83 from the shipping side. To see the split there is really quite surprising.
Yeah, and much more challenging. It's an international governed how the ships are operated between different areas of the world and different ports. So
and the degree, the difference in the degree of control that you can have over these different aspects. And yes, what else did I jot down? Well, the fact that yes, in 2012, when we were designing concessions, as you say, these green aspects were just not really in our minds at all, were they? You know, it was just so far away or not even thought about, that things have changed so much. And also, I think the point you made was very interesting about the fact that maybe the green aspects are more important for the port authority than the terminal operator. And this gets back to you might recall our discussions at the time about the different roles of the port authority and the terminal operator. That the terminal operator wants to make a profit, and that's fine. They're a profit-making company, and the port authority's got a different set of aims, you know, broader picture. And that's, I think, where it becomes challenging with these green levers, as you touched upon, to try and find a win-win lever, one that, you know, it's not just the port authority funding some green initiative, or it's not just the other way around, that both parties can find a way to benefit from this, and not just financially, but there's the kind of non-financial aspects as well, the social considerations on the port authority side. So it's a very complicated challenge, I think. And as you said, maybe the easiest way to get into this is evaluation of bids. You can build it into the bidding process. That's the most practical way.
Yeah, and because when you have concrete things written in the contract, fine, that's very good. But go above that, then that introduces some challenges. But just evaluating the different bids for a concession and putting emphasis, and also mentioning that we will put efforts and strong points in the green parts of the bid, and then it's up to the operator to include whatever they think they need to include to win the hearts and minds of the port authority for the concession. I think that is the most practical and realistic way. Yeah,
it becomes way more difficult if you try and think about modifying an existing concession, I think.
Oh yes.
I'm not sure, to be honest, I'm not sure where you would start.
I'm not sure if it's even legal. I think it's also to support private company is not completely legal to do if you're owned by the municipality that we are. So we cannot, regardless how much we want, we cannot legally support any initiatives, and also to do a material change in a concession is not legal either by EU law. So there are some for sure challenges, even if you have a good agenda.
Interesting. All right, thank you for that. Well, yeah, as time is moving on, I think we should move on to our final speaker, who's James Nganga from the African Development Bank, based in Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire. He's the Principal Ports and Maritime Transport Officer, and his focus is on policy, public-private partnerships, financing and regulation across Africa. Prior to joining AFDB 5 years ago, James has over 20 years experience in logistics and port activities, railways, etc. in Africa, so very experienced. And he's kindly stepped in at short notice to cover today's slot for the AFDB. So thank you very much indeed for that, James. And James is going to talk about the banker's view, or the bank's view, of this kind of thing, but in particular the mandate that AFDB has to introduce green standards across the port sector, which I think could be very interesting. That if you have some kind of standardization of green issues, then it may be easier to build them into concessions. So James, if you would like to take the floor, please.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, and thank you for the call and the clarification on what I want to take a slightly different approach from the other colleagues and actually build my discussion over and above what they have just said. It's been very useful to highlight some of the countries. It's been useful, especially when our colleague from the World Bank talked of the country approach and the global approach. In the scenario that we find ourselves in as the Africa Development Bank, we find ourselves with more or less three broad categories of countries and ports situations in the maritime sector. We have the first tier or the first group, that is the ports that are exposed to global partners, have global players, terminal operators within the operations. Then we have ports that are publicly run in countries that have ability to raise resources one way or the other. Then we have a third group of ports and countries and the maritime economies, which we have to work with them through grant facilities or through what we call the African Development Fund. So this poses different challenges when it comes to these issues of green transition, green ports, shipping transition, and imposes certain obligations on ourselves as a development bank to kind of provide support that would enable them embrace and move with the rest of the maritime community globally. So in this context, we see that there are several prerequisites that would enable us to actually catalyze this development, decarbonization, green shipping corridors, green operations in ports. And one of the key things is the readiness, the issue of readiness and ability to embrace low carbon transport and shipping operations. A lot has been done, and we congratulate the IMO for the progress that they have made, especially with the adoption of the greenhouse gas emission strategy last year. But we do see that there is need within the continent to actually get as many countries as possible to embrace this, and that there is need to identify change agents and champions. And actually that will be the thrust of our approach when I come to the last slide to actually articulate what kind of approach you are looking at. We also see that there is need to actually help our countries and our ports be able to actually embrace and accept the whole process of the energy transition, have standards and expectations of what is required and guidelines of what is required. Remember, our countries and our space, you will find the global port operators who have the ability that they have global operations. They are able to bring practices from other regions into areas where they already have concessions or are planning to acquire concessions. And our port authorities are faced with that environment that they are dealing with players that have structures and capacities to embrace new changes within their setup as quickly as possible. But a good number, if you undertake a quick rapid assessment study, a good number of our ports authorities, maritime authorities, are yet to be clear on exactly what this decarbonization entails and how it ought to be done. So that is one of the aspects that we are saying that there is need for guidelines on the greening of our shipping corridors. And we as an institution are coming from a background where we've had a lot of experience and exposure to supporting regional economic corridors with a lot of success, because quite a number of our countries are also landlocked, 16 of them. So we are also coming from that background where we have been successful in stimulating the development of regional economic corridors. And we think there are aspects that we can cascade in the development of shipping corridors, in the decarbonization agenda, into mainstream in the shipping corridors, as we also anchor the same practices on our transport economic corridors and come up with unique strategies for embracing and for deploying greenhouse emission initiatives and low carbon fuel use across the continent. So that's where I begin from. To enable us do this, we recognize we are fully mandated in this aspect. I won't go into the IMO issue again. The African Union has clearly mandated us. We also have the climate change and green growth strategy of the bank, which mandates and provides a framework for undertaking these initiatives, not only in the transport sector, but in the different economic sectors that we are find ourselves operating in. And on this aspect, we have developed a program where we are looking at doing a rapid assessment across 10 African countries. Again, this is to enable the countries to develop country-specific response action plans, national action plans that will anchor these aspects of decarbonization, efficiency, green efficiency in ports, as well as, where possible, shipping corridors. And I would want to put more trust on ports, and in view of the fact that a lot of our flags, a lot of the shipping traffic that comes our way is not flagged within our continent. So we are also, and to support this, or to help us embrace also green shipping initiatives, we have reached out to our colleagues in the International Association of Ports and Harbors, and we are looking at supporting them to implement the Environmental Ship Index program across the continent. ESI has been present in a number of years, but we Ship Index program, which we are looking at as one of the incentives or adoption incentives. I think our colleague from DP World did talk of adoption incentives. So we are looking at it as one of the adoption incentives to anchor some of the national measures, especially when it comes to efficiency in terms of the shipping traffic that visits and calls the ports within the area of jurisdiction that we are looking at. So that is on my left. The critical pillar is to come up with the port incentive programs to support mainstreaming of green ports by undertaking not only baseline studies, but also supporting the introduction of the environmental ship index. As I said earlier, the whole idea is to, in order to create the critical mass necessary for a reasonable level of adoption of green ports and shipping investment programs, is to now undertake the baseline studies, which I talked about, but in 10 countries. And fortunately, last week, we finalized some discussions with a donor who has in principle agreed that we can source the funding from them. And we are going to formalize the process so that we can then undertake a number of rapid assessment baseline studies to define the opportunities, to define the challenge, and define the opportunities, and critically most important, to also provide a capacity building framework to enable also our ports authorities, our maritime authorities have a common understanding of what all this entails and what ought to come out of this. And we believe through this process, we will also empower them to be able to negotiate for future interventions. And the other aspect that is associated with this particular second pillar is the aspect of facilitating these countries to develop green port policies so that then they can be able to set aside resources of their own, in addition to whatever we may help ourselves and other development partners mobilize to support and fund initiatives that are related to decarbonization, green port operations. So the idea of behind the policies is then, and I'm not an expert, a legal expert, but I see an opportunity through the policies then to also maybe catalyze for the existing concessions which are already in place, an opportunity for some commitments to be agreed upon, guided by the relevant policies that we are going to catalyze as a result of this work. It's not, the whole idea is to empower the port authorities and the different authorities to be able then to even have better dialogue with their concession operators in their respective ports. And finally, within the third pillar of our approach, proposed approach, what we are looking at is, in addition to capacity building, is a certification program for ports. And this, what we are saying here is we would want to see in place an industry-based green ports certification program. And the idea would then enable, would be that it would enable ports and all the stakeholders to have kind of a uniform outlook of what is expected, have a mechanism for how it is audited in terms of compliance, and provide a process which then provides recommendations or measures that are needed to be included in order to address and enhance and to be able to ensure that that process of green port certification is sustainable on a long-term basis for the different ports. So we are very keen to introduce an industry, and I want to emphasize the word industry-based scheme. So we will work out the mechanisms as part of this initiative, for which we are grateful that one of the governments is willing to support us and work with us, and we will be putting it together, formalize it so that we can then roll it out, and we see how best it helps in making sure that the African continent, which in some of the aspects has been left behind, is also on board such a program. So thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you very much, James. That's excellent. Very interesting initiative that you have running there. Looking at my notes that sprang to mind as you were speaking, the word readiness came up as an interesting one. Yes, you know, the question of being ready or not. And the capacity building question was very significant. I think the importance of building the ability to analyze these topics and to have the expertise to hand. And or perhaps you can stop sharing your screen now, James, as well, please. Yeah, the capacity building, which sort of fits in nicely with what WAPP is about in terms of helping to build capabilities in the PPP world. And of course, yeah, the Green Port certification scheme. I suppose if we, cut to the chase, James, can you see a situation in the future where a port or a terminal operator that is compliant with the scheme ends up getting a more favorable interest rate on a loan?
Okay, that is a good question. In terms of a more favorable interest rate, that's something we can discuss as we develop the scheme, because the details of the scheme are yet to be worked out. That's something that we can discuss. Because it's a very important question. What is it? What you're trying to say is what is in store for us from the terminal operator's perspective or the port authority perspective. But that's something we'll look at. And thanks for highlighting it.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just make one of our colleagues called David had posed a question about climate resilience and adaptation efforts. With your permission, or at an appropriate time, you'll give me a minute to say something about it.
Okay, yes, we'll keep that in mind. We'll see how the time goes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we have got some questions. My colleague Eric has been putting some questions through. One of which is to Victor about the ocean park being 83% of the total emissions. And is the Port of Gothenburg applying differentiated port dues to vessels on green fuels? And I think you are, and you have been for a while, haven't you?
Yes, and probably they would need to be stronger rebates and initiatives the greener the fuel you have. However, the total cost of calling a port and Port of Gothenburg, the port dues that we have are still just a small share of the total cost. So it's a nudge in the right direction, but it doesn't change the entire picture and doesn't cover the additional cost for the shipping line. But for sure, that is something that the Port Authority is willing to try to favorize. Yes, and we have, and we will adjust them moving forward in the future.
So I suppose, being devil's advocate, if you can give a shipping line a more favorable port due for being green, can't you give a terminal operator a more favorable lease for being green?
If we do it in the beginning, but not change it as it's running. The tariff is for everyone. A tariff is a tariff, but a contract to one private company is a contract to one private company, and it will be considered as subsidies from the publicly owned to the private sector.
Yes,
which
yes.
makes it quite different. But if we'd had all the the concession fees as the tariffs, then
it would be different.
Yeah.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Yes, yeah. Yes. Piotr, do you have any thoughts on the this thorny question of cheaper lease or renegotiating a concession?
Don't think I really have any case studies to share. I think as Victor described, all of this, I think it's a very new topic, and I've only so far we have seen it come up in situations where we were bidding for new concessions. And it's literally been the past 2-3 years where we've actually seen this as a requirement. But no, we just haven't had experience renegotiating or financing it through such mechanisms yet.
Yeah, it's still early days. Yes, yes. Which I think answers another question that's come up about any examples of concession extensions. So yeah, that's answered another of the questions already. Also a question to World Bank and AFDB. When providing technical assistance or financing to port authorities and other authorities on new port concessions, have you included in your existing policies and frameworks as tender requirements some of these referred green levers, so extra credits for zero-emission fleets? Yeah, so have we had any examples of using green levers in bids so far that we know of, I think is really the question.
I think just a general comment to this. I mean, what we see in a lot of discussions, and I think equally today, is we're trying to find the person or the party who's willing to pay extra or sacrifice a profit margin, right, to enable green. And that's kind of, I mean, we come more and more to the conclusion that, I mean, this can be the way to go. And I think it comes back to what James very nicely put, is to embrace the power of regulation, the regulatory environment we operate in shipping and ports. And that is largely governed by the IMO. Now, I think within our sector, we are pretty much aware of it, but outside of the sector, a lot of stakeholders do not embrace that policy environment. And I think that's why the IMO and the rules, the way they were for the past years in terms of GHG and those green credentials, there was no pressure on the organization. Now that has changed, as James put it, with the revised strategy. But again, now we're at a point where we have a commitment set out to reduce emissions, air pollution, and the likes. But we don't have the rules yet, which really mandate the adoption of, be it shore power, be it the provision of green fuels, but also the scope of emissions spillover to port operations themselves. So I think for development banks, organizations like WAPPP, it's important to keep on building this. I don't want to say to kind of advocate for these rules to be concrete, because once we have the rules in place, and a good example I always used to quote is the sulfur cap on the sulfur limit in green marine in marine fuel 2020, when I think there was a lot of discussion. You all may remember this, concerns that will enough fuel be available, and who's going to make all these investments into refinery upgrades to provide a 0.5% sulfur fuel globally. And if we then look back to 1st January 2020, when the rules came into force, all of a sudden all the fuel was there, right? So it worked. So what I want to say is the IMO is working on the basis, has successfully worked on the basis of mandates. Investments were made, fuel was safely supplied, and the same it would be the same ideal scenario for this transition, because that would prevent us, or that would sort of help us not to go down a route where we continuously have to find someone to pay a premium to do something for the greater good. Again, the business case is not rock solid in this case, but if we had the rules to create the framework, the market can adapt, and there's a case also from a risk perspective to invest in such infrastructure, be it shore power, and to have a business case to sell that power to ships because they have to use it. We see it in the EU, the Fuel EU maritime legislation, but also the requirement for cruise ships and container ships to use shore power. I mean, the shore power discussion, I guess a lot of port professionals will have had that experience. It's been hovering for a long time, but a lot of those shore power connections have been not utilized, have not been used, because again, the requirements to use them is not there. And we need to find public money, taxpayers' money ultimately to make this work and viable. And I think that's not good, right? That's not a good use of resources. So again, my final point would be to make sure that we understand within the community and outside the community how important these rules are, and advocate in the IMO space with governments, with member states, as the AFDB does with a lot of African countries, to say how important it is to have these rules in place, and then the private sector can come in, and for the government it will also bear less risk. Yeah, I stop here.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really important point, that regulation can be the driving force, and if there's suddenly regulation that says every piece of container handling equipment in a container terminal has to be electrified, then the mind is immediately concentrated, and the green levers happen almost automatically. I know that's an extreme example, suggestion, but that's the gist of it, isn't it? So it also, I mean, another aspect to this, and maybe you could speak to it, Piotr, is whether this whole question, or how much this varies between small, medium, and large terminals when we're talking about electrification and green levers. There's a big difference between a 100,000 TEU terminal and a 2 million TEU terminal in this context, isn't there?
Say yes and no. To me, it's more of a question about not the size of the terminal, but the location of the terminal. First, I would say, Europe or Northern America, in many cases, Southern America, or kind of the likes of Korea, for example, will always be, no matter the size, they'll always be the first movers, mainly because of that, mainly because of the advancements in the power infrastructure, and simply the ability to do it, as well as the ability of OEMs to deliver to these locations, as well as train the operators. It's much more difficult in developing countries. We are in the middle of just constructed a number of terminals in Africa, where in fact we're not even connected to the grid. The electricity there is oftentimes generated by diesel generators, in which case, to be honest, it's better to operate diesel equipment if you look at CO2 emissions rather than electric equipment on diesel generators. So to me, the economies of scale will not come from, whether it's a terminal that needs 10 terminal tractors versus 600 terminal tractors. The economies of scale will come by terminal operators like us, like EPMP and so on, coming together and signaling the total demand of organizations, and then we can distribute it accordingly to different operating entities.
Yeah, and I think that illustrates the point, doesn't it? It's about the bigger picture. It's not just about what's happening inside the terminal. It's outside the terminal gates. It's the country. It's the grid. It's the whole story gets involved. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yes.
Maybe I could also very quickly comment on the question you asked, James, because I think it was very interesting about would the green initiatives attract lower interest rates? And I think it's not just about the interest rates, but it's sometimes it's just purely about the availability of finance, even under standard interest rates. To give you an idea, we have raised a $1.5 billion green bond last year, which was raised against the use of proceeds from it. I wouldn't say that the interest rate was more attractive than standard bonds. However, that bond was oversubscribed. The interest in the market was tremendous, which made it a little bit easier to raise the required amount of finance than it would have under kind of regular non-green circumstances. So that's a benefit in itself.
Yes, there's the whole question of bankability as well as interest rates and conditions as well. Yes, it's a wider story. Yes. What other questions? I think we've covered those. Yep. We've got a question, somebody asking about what is the timeline for the AFDB baseline study agenda and building capacity. So I don't know, James, whether you could just quickly let us know about the timeline for your capacity building program.
Okay, we've just we're actually in the process of starting. It's a very good question, and as I said last week, we agreed with the Korean government that they're going to fund this process. So we are going to put together and formalize that whole framework and then be able to undertake the study. One of the regional port blocks, we are likely to approach them in the next week so that we can get at least some nominations of about 2 or 3 ports that we could then work with. So it's something that is of priority. It's something that we are working on currently. And it's in our almost priority that we have it done we have it started within this year, and we finish that assessment within this year. Let me put it that way. And then tied to, could I then comment on the adaptation issues?
We're almost out of time, and actually it's what that does raise helpfully is the fact that this is just one of hopefully a number of sessions that the WAPP port chapter want to run on this whole question of port PPPs and energy transition, and then linking into other WAPP chapters like David Dodd's, looking at the resilience and climate side of things. So I think it's a big enough subject that it warrants its own discussion. So hopefully that we can have a separate session, because we're out of time basically now. So I hope that's okay. So
the only comment I would make is just a minute, that in every project that we process to go to the board, we do a vulnerability assessment, and we partner with the Global Center for Adaptation, and we've done that, and we've identified, and we've been able to mobilize additional resources to support what has been defined by the assessment in Banjul, in Cotonou, and right now we are doing for Comoros.
So interesting. Great. Okay, yes. So as I say, hopefully there's other sessions, both the port chapter and other chapters in WAPP. Certainly for the port chapter, the next one we're thinking about is a focus on ports as a key node in the production, storage and distribution of green energy, and whether PPPs can play a role in distributing green energy through ports. At the moment, we're not aware of any PPPs in that sector or in that field. So if there's anyone who knows of any or is working on any and might like to showcase them in another session, then please let us know. Otherwise, I think I need to say a huge thank you to our 4 speakers for giving up their time and expertise and answering the weird and wonderful questions. So thank you, Rico, Victor, Piotr and James for your contribution. A very interesting session, I think. It has been recorded as far as I know, so people can watch back and listen back to particular aspects of it. Thank you to all the attendees as well, and enjoy the rest of your days. Thank you very much indeed.